Now for our final panel of this session, one of Singapore FinTech Festival, we will host Julie Sweet, Chief Executive Officer at Accenture, and Stephanie von Friedeburg, Interim Managing Director at the International Finance Corporation. We will close out the day talking about some of the key things that we have seen today, and I will talk with them, giving you highlights and key points there. And then we will also talk about the crossover to technology in our post-COVID world, as well as what some nations need to do to jumpstart their economies. That's what's happened here in the last 24 hours of the festival. Let's bring on Stephanie von Friedeburg right now, Interim MD, the International Finance Corporation.
Hi, Glenn. It's good to see you. How are you?
Hi, Stephanie. Great to see you as well. And Julie Sweet's going to join us in just a few minutes, but I have you to myself right now. So let's jump in and talk about some of the great content that we had throughout the day today already. And I know that you were particularly interested in what Sundar Pichai said, the CEO of Alphabet, talking about the public and private sector and building partnerships between government and business. This is a good topic, is it not?
Yes, it's a good topic for me, given that the International Finance Corporation is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And one of our objectives is to work in public-private partnerships and to really push the digital agenda, which I think is what he was getting at. How do you, I mean, he mentioned regulatory environments. How do you actually create the agility and bring the private sector into many of the countries where people are still disconnected and allow them to build out the networks, the infrastructure, and the skill sets to actually create digitalization and digital economies?
Yeah, and this connectivity, of course, there have been public-private partnerships, and there have been all kinds of work between these two entities happening for a long, long time. Do you see the need now more than ever to have this happen in light of where we are over the past 9, 10, 11 months?
So, Glenn, I do think that the COVID crisis has laid bare the inequalities in the world. And I love technology. I've been in technology for a long time. I've seen the silver lining that it has provided many of the developed world. But when I look at the poorest countries in the world, there's 3.6 billion people on the planet who don't have access to the internet. If they can't gain access to the internet, we can't build a truly digital economy, a global digital economy. I think they'll get left behind, and the digital divide will widen, not shrink. And when I look at the number of children who are not being educated right now, 450 million children are out of school, largely because their parents can't give them access to the internet or to any kind of connectivity. And our experience tells us that the majority of those will never go back.
It is a huge challenge, and many of our guests throughout the course of the past 24 hours have referenced that very point. Technology is wonderful for those of us who have 4G and 5G, but for many who do not even have access to the internet at all or at a very basic level, it is a huge challenge to not leave them completely behind as we go forward. I just want to check and see. I think we have Julie Sweet with us now. Julie, are you there with us?
I am. Thank you. How are you?
It's great to see you, Julie, of course, the CEO of Accenture. And Accenture is doing some really exciting things these days with your clients. And Julie, maybe you can just start off. We just talked about how Sundar Pichai of Alphabet was talking about the need to have these partnerships between government and businesses. And as you are talking to many of your CEO clients, are they also recognizing that need to maybe play a closer role with some of the governmental organizations that they are dealing with in terms of their business?
Absolutely. And I would say that this is global, but just picking up on what Stephanie was just saying, I literally just left a meeting with the Business Roundtable in the US, which is about the top 200 large companies in the US, not all of them, but most of them. And one of the things we were talking about specifically was this need to bring companies in both the federal and state and local governments together around bridging the digital divide, everything from, providing the device to providing the broadband access, and the critical nature of the need to actually have that partnership. And one plug I would ask is that it's absolutely critical right now. But even pre-COVID, many areas, that's true certainly in Asia, but in the US and rural areas, have been left behind. And one of the focus areas is that even when the vaccine comes and people are back in school, I mean, the financial impact of giving access is enormous. In the US, for example, every 1% increased penetration creates about 300,000 jobs. So this is an area that's ripe for collaboration, and it's something that we need to do, even as we hopefully are very excited to see the developments with the vaccine and what that will do hopefully soon to the global economy.
Yeah, we had a lot of interesting conversations over the past 24 hours, as you might well imagine, on this Singapore FinTech Festival. But one of them that we keep coming back to was now things might be different, right? Now that we can finally see that vaccine coming into countries and we see some sort of a timetable anyway for people to be inoculated. And Stephanie van Friedeburg, I'll just bring it to you first. At the IFC, are you changing any plans or seeing that as a game changer at all in your short-term or longer-term thinking now that we do have confirmation that those inoculations will be coming forward?
So Glenn, I'm maybe not quite as much of an optimist as the rest of the developed world. When I look at estimates in Africa, for example, the ability to provide vaccine coverage to 60% of the population may take us till 2023 and beyond. It's critical in all of our countries of operation that we make access to the vaccine feasible and fair. And so that will be one of our biggest focuses. As a matter of fact, we really believe that the private sector has a fundamental role to play in how we get not just the vaccine, but medical equipment and supplies into the emerging markets. So we created a $4 billion global health platform designed to do just that. I mean, imagine we need 10 times the number of ventilators on the planet that we have today. So there's 170,000 ventilators in the United States. There's 3 in the Central African Republic.
Right.
We need to produce 89 million masks a month. And the only way to do that is to really retrofit many of the clothing and garment manufacturers in Asia to help us do that. So we'll be focusing on that and vaccine production as soon as we know we can actually create those vaccines with efficacy.
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of issues to unpack with the challenges that we're facing now with the vaccine and moving forward. Let me bring back just one comment that was made in one of our leadership series conversations today between Zutphen Mohanty and the Chief FinTech Officer, of course, with the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And Jane Fraser, the new incoming CEO of Citi, as you well know, the first female to lead that organization, which is a fantastic new way forward for Citi. And one thing that Jane Fraser said was that Citi is well aware of the fact that they need to take their current legacy architecture, as she called it, and they must shift it to a more mobile and digital offerings. And of course, we're seeing many of the new digital banks coming in that are competing directly with some of the old line banking organizations. This in order to stay relevant. Julie Sweet, I know that you often work with your clients and take them through their process of digitization and moving forward in this way. How much work is there to be done to get organizations, especially fintech organizations, up to speed when it comes to their digital journey?
Well, the greater amount of work are the organizations that are being disrupted by the fintechs. So Jane, who is fantastic and super excited for her to take the helm at Citi, really articulated an issue that exists in pretty much every industry, because while there are some industries that are certainly ahead and others behind, our research really shows, and our experience serving clients is that pre-COVID, you had digital leaders. So we did research that looked at technology adoption, depth, breadth, leadership, and culture. And the top 10% were performing twice as well as the bottom 25%. And what we found was that no industry was full of leaders, but rather in every industry, there was this dichotomy between digital leaders and digital laggards. And of course, when COVID hit, that gap really became a chasm, right? As technology became a lifeline. Yeah. And many talked about the need for, and the actual fact of acceleration. The issue is that it's not any easier today to accelerate the transformation as it was pre-COVID. And it doesn't happen overnight. And it is everything from the challenges of a lot of investment in legacy debt, but even more the challenge of how organizations actually need to change. And one of the questions that I'm talking to a lot of CEOs about who are talking about, like, how do I move faster? How do I move as fast as we did when we were adjusting to the pandemic right after it was declared? And I ask a very simple question. What have you changed? Because the way that you make decisions, the way that you partner, the way that you reward people are all the kinds of things that will need to change if organizations want to move faster on their digital transformation. And 8 months in, we're really starting to see the difference where, the digital leaders who are, as I call it, positive paranoia, they're doubling down to widen the gap even more. And then you have those who were behind, some of them really making the decisions to leapfrog by doing things differently, and others who are feeling the pull of the same things that held them back pre-COVID. So it's an interesting question as we sit here today and see in many ways the light at the end of the tunnel, at least for the developed world, as you said, Stephanie. And so more to come.
Yeah, very interesting topic, and as you rightly point out, there are some that have beautifully embraced this challenge of the past 8-9 months, and that there are others that are still struggling to find their way forward, which I suppose is a good reason to have Accenture on board, right, to help people see the way, the path to the future. No commercial there, just an obvious point I'll make for you. One last point that I'd like to mention this and bring your comment into this, Stephanie, is when Jane Fraser talked about cities' impact around the world and talking about their microfinance programs and how they have patterned many of the programs that have been done across Asia and Africa and are now moving those into the Americas as well. And from the IFC's perspective, I know that you often work with NGOs and look at some of these programs that are so vitally urgent in smaller communities and more rural communities. To see a big bank like Citi really stepping up and acknowledging that, does that make it easier for the IFC and other organizations to push forward with microfinancing projects?
I think it should, Glenn. I mean, more than the majority of the world is actually employed in micro and SMEs. So it's an important part of the sector, especially as we think about how we come out of the crisis and continue to create jobs and economic growth. But back to the idea of using fintech to do just that, I do think there is a real fundamental difference between banking in the developed world, where you've captured your customer with a bank account, a credit card, a debit account. You've got point of sale equipment, easily reachable in all retail outlets. You've got ATMs to disperse cash. When you come into the countries of operation, that kind of bricks and mortar investment doesn't exist. And so the ability to use fintech to kind of leapfrog over, I think, was the start of the digital inclusion and digital revolution, which it continues to go more and more. So if you look at what a Full Truck Alliance in China is able to do, for example, they have loads of data. They have a digital platform that connects truckers. And then they said, what else can we do with this data? Well, we can actually start using embedded finance, and we can create insurance products. We can create small loans to allow a trucker to buy new tires or to improve his truck or to buy a whole new truck. And slowly but surely, that data and that build on AI gives you an advantage that a Citibank or some of the larger commercial banks are going to find very difficult to compete against. And I think it's good from a financial inclusion perspective because we know that there's 1.7 billion people on the planet that don't have access to a bank account. So this notion of financial health and, making your family and the generations beyond your immediate family stronger financially is very difficult without the basics of a bank account.
Yeah, we're in conversation with Stephanie von Friedeburg, the Interim Managing Director at the International Finance Corporation, and Julie Sweet, Chief Executive Officer at Accenture. Julie, I'd like to carry on with you. Let's talk about the crossover with technology. And you referenced it earlier. Stephanie, you've mentioned it as well, and I think it might serve us well to talk a little bit more deeply about technology at this moment in time and going forward. And the key trends, you've heard various trends, as I understand it, from CEOs about what they believe is going to be the major shift around the pandemic and what's happening around technology. Share us a little bit with us about what those executives are saying about how this shift is happening to them right now.
Sure. Well, one thing I want to just quickly build on from what Stephanie was talking about is in addition to the digital bank, digital identity is going to be really key. And we've done some work with the World Economic Forum, and at the Business Roundtable, I've led some work there, which we're sort of refreshing again to consider how we can make digital identities, which would be key to provide access. It's certainly something we've seen with the world's refugees, and there's a lot of work around that. But in these other areas, you need access to digital finance, but digital identity is going to be really clear, and that is going to be really key. And underneath that are emerging technologies like blockchain, which are starting to go into production. There's certainly been a lot of work done, for example, in Singapore. And so that's, I think, an encouraging trend and opportunity that is gaining momentum as we think about how to provide more access to those who have a difficult time reaching capital or having the basic services of a bank account. I mean, as you sort of step back and you say, what are the big trends? I'd start with cloud. And, when people say like, well, why is cloud, accelerating? And there's three basic reasons. The first is that when you move to the cloud, then what you're going to do is lower your infrastructure costs and improve your resiliency. And so that in terms of cost pressures is a big reason. But the second reason is really all about data. You just heard Stephanie talk about the power of data to do personalization and provide different services. We're sitting here in a world where all the old models have been thrown out, where you have to, relook at your supply chains. You're not sure what your customers want. And there's just a thirst for both data to run your business, but also to seek growth. And the cloud provides the compute power and the advanced services. And I will tell you what the leaders are doing right now is they are saying, how can I use artificial intelligence to create new products, to better know my customers and insert it into my value chain? And those leaders who already have a handle on data are able to do that. But if you don't have a handle on data and have that foundation built, then you're not going to be able to use artificial intelligence, which is the second big trend. It's existed for some time, but in a world that's gone contactless and online, the power of artificial intelligence when deployed in business to make a difference is really huge. And then the third reason that cloud is so critical is the thirst for innovation and the ability to leverage the billions and billions of dollars that the hyperscalers, whether it's Alibaba, Microsoft, Google, or AWS, are pouring in to the cloud and the services they're layered on top of them. And so, when we started in January 2020, I talked about the decade of transformation of the enterprise driven by digital and technology, and we expected that to take 10 years. We've now said And we believe that's a 3 to 5 year journey. On average, companies pre-COVID are saying we now want to cut in half our planned journey to the cloud. And that was one of the reasons why we announced in September the creation of Accenture Cloud First and a $3 billion investment in cloud in order to help accelerate. I mean, this is a once in a digital era global replatforming of business.
Wow, that's fascinating. And just those numbers, those statistics are mind-boggling when you think about the scale of that across so many international corporations across the world. And Stephanie, I want to talk to you about redeveloping and rebuilding global economies, but if we can stay on this idea of technology for just a moment. Julie was referencing, obviously, cloud and AI. When we think about 5G, we think about cybersecurity. These types of issues, are they coming into conversations in a deep way with IFC and your partners as you're looking to help rebuild economies and looking at the damage that has been done in the past year?
It does, Glenn, and we talk a lot about technology. Sadly, in most of our countries of operation, except in the upper middle income, you actually don't see 5G networks. You don't see the cloud infrastructure and the data centers being developed at the speed and at the efficiency that you might find in a data center that Julie referenced. So I think that's one area where we need to look. We also need to think about data security and data policy. So the US and the Europeans have taken a certain view on data and data privacy. The Asian countries have taken a different view, especially China. And I think in our countries of operation, what they're asking from a policy and regulatory perspective is how do we tackle this best? And I believe that it's time for us to think differently about data because to build data centers at the speed and size and efficiency that an Amazon Web Services or an Azure would run them is extremely difficult in little tiny countries that don't have adequate connectivity. So I think there's a big piece of work that needs to be done there to really start thinking about how best do we connect all companies, because I do believe that they will all be disrupted. I think you saw the wave of retail, the number of companies in the United States alone who have filed for Chapter 11 or for full bankruptcy. That was coming. It would have been, in my view, 5 or 6 years out, but the COVID crisis just toppled it over so that online retail became, the way of the future. So there's a lot of work to do in that space.
Yeah, and look, I know this isn't a conversation about data privacy, but since you mentioned it, I mean, is it not? Everyone that's watching this is going to be concerned with it. Of course, we all are. You cannot have a conversation about fintech without talking about data privacy. But in many ways, is that cow not already out of the barn? I mean, we are so far down the road with our personal data and our data lives, our data selves being in the public domain. How do we claw that back? How do organizations start to reel in and make more safe some of these fintech products that rely so heavily on so much data and so much data that's already out in the world?
So I don't know, Julie, if you want to jump in on that one, but one
Sure.
of the things
Yeah,
that
that's
I
fine.
would say about our country. So I look at some of the emerging markets, and what you gain by providing people access to your data is more than what you potentially see yourself giving up. And so I do think there's a cultural difference between the way that we think about privacy and data in the US and in Europe and the way that many of the citizens of countries that we invest in think about data, because they would rather have access to a bank account. They would rather be able to use a digital wallet or a digital form of payment, because that's better for them than carrying cash. It allows them, to save money at de minimis levels, but nonetheless to save money and to ultimately get access to other financial products. And so I think they're willing to give up more than we might be willing to.
Yeah, very interesting. Julie, I noticed that one of the statements I saw coming in the preparation material that we were talking about from Accenture was that your strategy is to deliver and measure 360-degree value by embedding responsible business by design across all aspects of the business. And when we think about technology and we think about security, as you mentioned, AI, cloud, cybersecurity, how do we effectively as corporations embed all these in an era when the technology is moving so quickly and the demands from customers and consumers and partners are also evolving very quickly?
Well, Glenn, fortunately, there's a good business case, both from an efficiency, from attracting employees, from attracting consumers, as well as good partners with being a responsible business. Too interesting to statistics. Some research we'll publish in January says that's global, including a significant representation of Asia, have 82% of companies saying they're going to invest in large-scale digital transformation. 62% of those companies say that they believe they need to embed more responsible business practices around inclusion and diversity, around climate, and around the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that is an incredibly I think, exciting statistic in terms of that. It's interesting in the research, particularly in Southeast Asia and broader and in APAC, about 60% of companies said they weren't ready to do so, however, meaning they didn't have all of the tools. And one of the things, our strategy around 360-degree value, which we just rolled out, we did so in connection with our new purpose, which is to deliver on the promise of technology and human ingenuity. And to do so, we really believe that we need to be a facilitator of delivering not only the business case, the unique capabilities, the types of experiences that our clients are seeking, but for the clients who do want this, to embed sustainability, inclusion and diversity, and upskilling of employees as a part of what we bring clients. And what does that tangibly mean? I talked earlier about the move to the cloud. We built a proprietary tool that allows you to measure your carbon reduction so that and moving to the cloud and out of your own data centers, so that that can be part of a compelling reason to move more quickly to the cloud and tie it to changes in the economy. Today, lots of companies are under cost pressures. We've introduced a whole pillar that allows, when we do our normal work that we've done for decades on how do you reduce costs, to look at social risk. For example, when companies are consolidating suppliers in order to get economies of scale, what does that do to the diverse suppliers that they've previously invested in? It's also looking at energy efficiency. If you're taking down costs of energy, you could do so with or without a view to, are you using renewables? We're doing supply chain work today. Lots of clients are trying to get better data around their supply chain. Well, when you build the data lakes that help them give the analytics on the supply chain, without that much extra work, you can actually build in the third-party data sources that allow you to run algorithms to better identify risks of corruption, child labor, and other things. And what I think is exciting is that because of the large-scale change that's being driven by technology, you can begin to embed these in a much more cost-efficient way and a speedier way than, frankly, pre-COVID, when things were going to take longer. Yeah. It does take a mindset that has to start at the top, where you're embedding these things by, first of all, having those people who are knowledgeable and understand them at the table and part of the strategy, so you can identify the opportunities. And we as a company are now making these things standard in our offerings to help companies do that faster.
Julie, if you were to put some money down on it, what would you say the mindset, as you mentioned, is going to be in 2021 and going forward? Are people ready to make these changes? Do they understand that they have to make them quickly, or they could find themselves struggling in the future?
I think this mindset of speed is clear from a business perspective. I mean, despite, for example, in Europe, the second wave that's come, we're seeing companies are pushing ahead with investments. And it's this mindset of saying, we're no longer going to navigate the crisis. We're going to face our new reality, and we're going to adapt to that. And I think it's encouraging to see the commitment from companies to do so in a responsible way. I think all of us need to answer Stephanie's call to not forget regions like Africa. And one of the things that will help us do that is a return to growth, right? I always say in my own company and in the global economy, growth solves a lot of things, but we have an opportunity to make that inclusive growth. And I truly believe there is a global commitment among business to do so, and to do so together with others, including competitors, and with the world's governments and institutions like the IFC.
Thanks, Julie. That brings us to a great segue to our next mini segment here that I'd like to talk with you both about. And Stephanie, I'd like to talk with you first about reviving economies around the world. And many are flagging, many have seen a lot of either very slow growth or negative growth. What is your outlook for the global economy as we look into 2021, 2022?
So, Glenn, our last estimates from the IMF were in October, and they were thinking that the global economy would contract by about 4.5%. I think that was optimistic. And if you look at the ongoing waves of the virus across Europe and the United States and in other parts of the world, I think we're going to see an even bigger recession. It is the worst decline that we've seen since the Great Depression. And the only place that we're actually anticipating economic growth at a little under 1% is in Asia. But I do think in many ways that masks the bigger problem. And so if you look at pre-crisis where countries sat, most of them were constrained in relation to their fiscal space. They have used that limited fiscal space to create liquidity, to provide the healthcare that was necessary for their citizens. And in the poorest parts of the world, there is just no debt service capacity left. We've been working on something called the DSSI, which is a way to think about debt service suspension initiatives in the poorest countries of the world. Of the 73 countries that have joined the DSSI, 43 of them will pay more money back in debt service than they will spend on healthcare, just to give you a sense of the magnitude. So the only way we'll come out of this crisis it is through the private sector. And I really do believe that now is the time for the private sector to truly push in emerging and developing economies. So the way that we're thinking about it is against 3 R's. The first is relief. So how do we provide liquidity to as many companies as we can so that they can make it through the crisis and not become insolvent? The second is to think about restructuring. So as those companies actually hit insolvency, can we and other financiers, but development finance institutions in particular, step in and help restructure that debt so that we can preserve as many jobs and as many livelihoods as possible? And then I think the last piece is the recovery piece, which is, as Julie said, is really about building back better. And from our perspective, this is at the core of our strategy, because if we don't get this right, it could take as long as 10 years for foreign direct investment and domestic investment in our countries of operation to come back. We don't have that amount of time.
Yeah, big business does have a lot of money in their pockets right now looking for a home. How do you convince them that when we still are in very uncertain times, that now is going to be the time to make a big push, as you say, to have the private sector come out and start reinvigorating economies? We've seen that governments have pumped a lot of money into their economies. Much of that money is about to run out the end of this year or Q1 of next. So how do we then engage the private sector to say, look, it's a good bet for you to get involved now?
So, Glenn, this is really the core of our strategy. And our strategy actually predates the COVID crisis, but we call it IFC 3.0, speaking of technology. But it's really about figuring out how we create bankable projects in our countries of operation to attract the private sector. So that's really a combination of 2 things. First, it's working what we call working upstream, but working much more closely with policy and regulation to ensure that we get the right environment to induce that private sector investment. So we've talked a little bit about telecom and communications infrastructure. That requires policy and regulation to make it happen, especially with private sector investment. We've talked about fintech. That requires policy and regulation so that we can attract the private sector. So areas like that really push to ensure that we get as much done with the private sector, and we use the limited fiscal space in places where the private sector really won't invest, rural roads, elementary education, things like that. And then you mentioned all of the patient capital that's sitting on the sidelines, and it's true. They had the Addis conference in 2016, and this is where we saw the $1 trillion of patient capital in low and negative yielding instruments sitting on the sideline looking for yield. That is pension money for nurses and teachers everywhere in the world. And so our job is to figure out how we can create bankable projects and bring that money into emerging markets where there's yield and where we'll ultimately get better development impact as we try to incent people to come into emerging markets coming out of the crisis.
Julie, do you sense that your clients or the CEOs you've been talking to, maybe some of you who were just in a roundtable with, do you sense that they are open to that line of thinking that the private sector now needs to really jump in a big way? And I know you're not an economist per se, but do you sense that that would make sense to them based on the conversations you're hearing?
Well, I mean, I think that the philosophy does. I mean, whether companies who are not already sort of capital, investing companies are thinking about, for example, expanding to the kinds of companies the IFC serves, I would say that would not be top of their priority list right now, as they're still sort of trying to sort out their own economic stimulus, in their countries, as you said, where things are starting to grow out. I think the point is that we need to get to some stabilization. And then as you do have bankable projects, I think there'll be a desire to participate. But I would say right now, as optimistic as we all are, I think Stephanie started in the right place. We continue to navigate a very, very difficult environment. And so we've got to, there's a lot, if the problem will be is if it's not already a top priority, companies are not tending to expand right now, particularly to hard things, versus going after markets where they're more familiar.
Yeah. Do you sense that? And I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but I sense that companies are still relatively inward-looking to see what they can do to fix themselves right now before taking the step forward to be outward-looking or outward-acting. Is that a fair estimation?
No, I wouldn't say that actually, and that's why I'm actually long-term optimistic that the kinds of work, for example, the IFC was talking about, I think are going to get a boost because I actually see companies now, because look, this was the first thing that's ever happened that was truly global, right? That affected also every single person, whatever your economic bracket was, right? And I think what you've seen instead is a remarkable focus on both company and community. I'm a member of the B4 Inclusive Growth that was started by out of the G7 a couple of years ago with President Macron and the OECD. And I would tell you, a year ago in the summer when we started, some of the CEOs showed up and a lot of staff came. When we just had our recent meeting, you had every CEO there. And what happened in between? The pandemic and the research that showed the pandemic hurt the most vulnerable around the world, disproportionately. And the commitment that says we have to do this, I think is stronger than ever. And probably the most important thing is it's a commitment to do things together. I mean, one of the things I ask myself and I advise companies to say is that when someone in your organization wants to do something in the community, the first question should be, who else is doing it? And who's better at it? Because we have to get scale. It's the same question, by the way, that we ask ourselves and we help our clients ask themselves when they're trying to do technology or build new solutions, right? It's that, it's better to partner. And we've known that for years. But the same is true. And I will say that we used to talk about this all the time. We all are investing. We all have programs. What we're seeing now is a change. And you see competitors sitting down together and doing things, not putting names on things. I think it's incredibly exciting, as we look forward as to the possibilities.
Very, very interesting. Speaking with Julie Sweet, CEO of Accenture, and of course, Stephanie von Friedeburg, Interim Managing Director at the International Finance Corporation. Stephanie, to you, a while earlier you mentioned that Asia was the only region that's really going to see some growth, and it probably does a fair amount of disservice to categorize and clump all of Asia together. There are so many different economies and countries. But if we can broadly look at this region, what has this region, Asia Pacific, ASEAN, what has it done right in recent months to get through this storm better than other parts of the world?
So, Glenn, I think they've done a very good job managing the COVID crisis, getting the outbreaks under control. And I did say that it is the one part of the world where we see growth, and it's growth at a little under 1%. But if you pull China out of that, because China really, we're expecting, given the stimulus, given all that they've done, we're expecting to see growth in the Chinese economy. The contraction in the rest of East Asia is going to be somewhere in the range of 3.5%. Yeah. That's an estimate, but that's the lowest. It's the lowest growth rate, if you want to call it a growth rate, since 1967. So I think we're going to see disparities across different countries in Asia, and this is where we need to be prepared. We will definitely see some scars and some unexpected changes. So supply chains are changing. You heard Julie talk a little bit about use of technology in supply chains, but in a recent World Bank survey, we found that 58% of the CEOs in emerging markets that we interviewed are now using technology in their supply chains, and they're thinking about repositioning, nearshoring, onshoring. We're going to see some changes there, which I think will potentially not necessarily help the Chinese and the East Asian economies. The number of poor in Asia, we're going to see rise. So globally, we think 150 million people will fall into extreme poverty over the course of the next year. And we think that somewhere in the range of 30 million or so of those will be in the East Asian countries. That's a very big number when poverty has not declined, for 20 years in East Asia. So we need to think about how do we push the agenda there. The upside of it, however, is that there is opportunity. So you've seen that the Chinese government is pushing very hard on new infrastructure, their new infrastructure build and building back green. That should help if we can pull coal out of any electricity production in Asia. As we think about rebuilding, that should be beneficial for the economy. So I think Asia is really the place that we need to be watching, because they've got a good balance on many fronts in terms of what they've done well, but we need to make sure that we don't continue to push people into poverty anywhere in the world, but in Asia in particular.
Yeah, how do we attack some of these problems in a region where there's such disparity between countries? Some very much first world at the top of the pyramid, others very much toward the middle or the bottom of the pyramid. There is definitely not one size fits all, right, when it comes to moving forward.
Yeah, Glenn, there's definitely not one size fits all. And, we always say that the development begins at the country level. So it's really a matter of understanding, where does that country sit? What are its needs? How can we ask the development community to help and the developed world to step in and help us as we think about building back better?
Julie, from Accenture's perspective, do you recommend a slightly different course of action for your clients who are based in Asia versus, let's say, North America or Europe, predicated on the idea that Asia has done a little bit better with COVID? Of course, many countries here are in their second or third wave, but still they have a plan, they have a way to attack it, and they attack it aggressively. Does it make a difference in how you counsel your clients that have operations in the Asia Pacific region?
Well, what I would say is maybe more like what we're seeing, right? So we're, and it's very interesting. We have clients who, pre-COVID, when we were going through investment priorities, expanding into some new markets in Asia might have been fourth or fifth on the growth priority list. And when COVID happened, based on the resilience of the Asian markets, that you saw those flip in a very tangible way. I mean, one of the things that we're really working with clients on is looking at, are there some long-term competitive implications based on how countries are responding, not just how the resiliency, but whether, which countries are taking the tougher decisions with respect to the use of automation, changing jobs, reskilling their employees. You look at a country like Singapore that is so advanced in already pre-COVID in digital banks and fintech and the digital economy, in investing in reskilling. The monetary authority, Singapore Monetary Authority, having the new plank around sustainable finance. The competitiveness of Singapore, and really that private sector, public sector combination is only being enhanced through COVID by their response and their focus already on digital. And so what we're really watching carefully is how those partnerships are coming together, whether or not governments are incentivizing the right actions, sort of embracing technology, but helping those who are going to be displaced through partnerships. And we do see that long term, there could be a significant shift as a result of both how the pandemic was declared, but also the speed of change and embracing of technology. And that's certainly on the minds of many of our clients.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Stephanie, as we look forward, and I know we've been looking forward, but as we go even further forward, we keep the economic factor or component in this discussion, but let's look beyond that. And I know the IFC has been looking at other things, reducing inequality, building human capital, fulfilling long-term emission reduction goals. All of these in our 21st century world surely have to be discussed at the same time that we are talking about economic growth based on the imperatives of the climate change issue and others. Where is the IFC moving forward on these discussions, and how much are you pushing those in relation to the standard economic formulas or discussions that you're having?
Glenn, I think it's more important now than it's ever been. And again, I think I said very early on that the crisis really laid bare the inequalities in the world, the inequality, the human capital, the issues with human capital, the issues with connectivity, and ultimately, the issues with climate and the planet. So these have always been very core to what we do. We always invest with impact in mind. So we have an anticipated impact score that we use to measure everything that we do. So we don't just look at financial returns, but we look at how are we actually going to attain impact. And I think we're going to be more focused on that now than we ever have been. Our stakeholders and our shareholders are pushing us very hard to think about building back green, to think about how do we create the human capital that's necessary. So we've heard a lot about digital skill sets, upskilling employees. How do we actually get to a point where someone can use a handset and be able to access fintech? So we'll have all of those on our radar as we think about building back better. And it will be more important than it's ever been. And I would maybe add to that we can't forget the millennials and the asset owners who are shifting as part of this conversation as well. So we talked a little bit about impact investing, but we have created these impact principles, which we now have 106 signatories to. Some of the largest investors in the world have signed up to our principles to say, as we invest, we're going to think about what impact are we going to have. We're going to measure that impact independently of ourselves, and we're going to make money on the way out. So it's a combination of those things to say that you can do good and do well at the same time.
Julie, are you hearing your clients express similar hopes or aspirations, doing the right thing for the planet, doing the right thing for people, but also hoping to look for a profit on the way out?
Not only that, but our clients believe that you have to do both, right? That purpose and profit are absolutely linked. And the same millennials that Stephanie was just talking about, the companies where they want to work, the products that they want to buy, they care about companies who truly, live and embrace what people call stakeholder capitalism, right? So shareholders, employees, communities, partners. At Accenture, we call it shared success, right? And really making sure that in everything we do, we have shared success, which is a lot nicer than stakeholder capitalism. It's sort of, I think, more visually lovely. And I do believe that we have an opportunity to have the lasting effects of the pandemic be embracing shared success. And I'm seeing it at companies and today all around the globe. And it's something we all, I think, have to continue to strive for.
How do we bring the naysayers along with us? We still have climate change deniers. We still have people that are not necessarily focused on these things. What do those discussions look like? I'll actually pass it to both of you on this. Let's start with you, Stephanie. There are still people out there that don't necessarily want to come into this millennium.
Yeah, Glenn, it's an interesting question, and I look no further than the Northern Triangle and the two storms that hit Central America back to back. The once in 100-year storm that came twice in a month. I think the Philippines was just recently experienced another bad storm, which was again a 100-year storm that's happened twice in the last 10 years. I look at the locust swarms in Africa, which is wiping out crops. Again, those are all climate related. My guess is that we will eventually all have to realize that this is climate related, and all we can do is continue to push and to pull so that people put the planet first.
Yeah, and Julie, I'll give you the last word on this. From your perspective, how do you perhaps counsel some clients that may not be quite as evolved as others? Maybe that's a polite way of putting it in terms of these issues.
Well, I think it's two things. First of all, consumers and employees are pushing them. Yeah. And so there won't be a choice, and financial results matter. I mean, I go back to at Accenture, we believed in inclusion and diversity, and we doubled down back in 2014. We've had a 9% CAGR since then, and we couldn't have done it except for our commitment to inclusion and diversity. And when I shared that story and those financial results, and by 2025, we will be 50-50 men and women. Today, we're 45% out of 500,000. When you share those results, right, people pay attention. And so leaders have to be transparent. They have to share the results. And then we have to impose, these things. I look at all of our major suppliers to see whether they're doing the right thing with their supply chains and whether they're doing the right things themselves with inclusion and diversity. And I do that as CEO. And so that's the advice. We have to own it as leaders and then demonstrate the results.
Ladies, a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time. Stephanie von Friedeburg, Julie Sweet, really appreciate your thoughts, your insights. And more than that, looking at the comprehensive summary of economic priorities and the way forward as we move into 2021. Thank you so much for your time.